Whether you are preparing for picnic season or packing a breakfast for your commute, or you want a quick sewing win, this roll-up pouch is the perfect project. To make this little cutlery wrap, I'm starting with a 12.5 by 12.5 piece of quilting cotton, which is 31.75 by 31.75 centimeters. But 12 inches or 30.5 centimeters would be fine as well. I just picked this size because that was the size of my ruler. And then I cut a strap that was 12.5 by 2 inches or 31.75 by 5 centimeters. Then to make the strap, fold it in half and press in a center crease. Then fold the sides towards the center crease and press those as well. After folding and pressing in the sides, we're going to fold the strap in half and give it a final press. And as you're pressing, you want to make sure you're going to align the folded edges as best as you can. Then fold the end of the strap with the right sides together and make sure that the folded edges are aligned and put in a pin. And then you can sew the strap close to the raw edge. But first prepare the other side. I just align the raw edge to the edge of my presser foot and then sew over the end. And I know I just pulled out the pin, but it's better to leave in the pin, put the needle down using the hand wheel on the side of your sewing machine and then start sewing. This way you'll have a better chance of keeping those edges nicely aligned while you sew. Take a moment to trim the seam allowance and thread tails before you turn the fabric strap. Then use a needle or something pointy to push out the corners. And repeat this step for both sides. Give the strap a final press, aligning the folded edges as you go. Then sew close to the folded edges, closing the strap. To get nice even stitching along the strap, I position the strap in the gap of my presser foot and then slightly move the needle position to the left. And then, as I start sewing, I just focus on aligning that edge to the gap in the presser foot. And if I see any stray threads poking out, I use a needle to push them into the strap. And then after sewing, trim the thread tails and cut off one end of the strap at 6 centimeters or about 2 1/3 inch. Then put aside the straps for now and grab your main piece of fabric. Fold the square in half on a diagonal with the right sides facing each other. And then I'm marking where I want to leave an opening for turning the triangle. You can do it with pins, I'm using a marker. To mark the tip of the corner, first I measure where the seam allowance is going to be. I'm going to be sewing at about 6 millimeters or 5 millimeters, which is about 1/4 inch. Then I measure 2.5 centimeters or 1 inch from that folded edge up to the seam allowance. After marking the corners and the opening, I'm ready to sew. And at the opening, I'm going to sew off the edge, and then when you turn the project right side out, the seam allowance is supposed to fall inward really nicely, but I think the opening is a little bit too big and the seam allowance is a little bit narrow, so it doesn't work as well. I'm sewing with a 1/4 inch or 6mm seam allowance. As you get to the corners, take your time, put the needle down and pivot the project. Now you can see I'm slightly overshooting where the markings are, but I just course correct as I go. When I get to the markings, I will do a couple of back stitches and then sew off the edge. And then for the other side of the opening, I'm going to sew onto the fabric, pivot at the marking, do a couple of back stitches and then keep sewing. I think it works better with a wider seam allowance, but somebody recently, I think, commented on a video and I saw it, I think, in a reel, and I really wanted to give it a go. Normally I would just do a basting stitch across where the opening should be, so that way I can press it open before I remove those basting stitches and turn the project. After sewing, I trim off the corners and snip off the thread tails. And then you're ready to turn the project right side out. After poking out the corners, we're going to press the seam. And you might need to roll it between your fingers to get a nice fold on that seam line. I've sped this whole section up, but I think for this project, rolling those seams and pressing them is probably what takes the longest. It might be helpful to push something in from the inside, like a pair of scissors or a metal ruler, and push out those seams. I do find this method a little bit fiddly, so let me show you what I often do with using the basting stitches, and you can see the difference and how it works. Where the opening is supposed to be, I've kept stitching. I've done a back stitch and then elongated the stitch length, done another back stitch and kept sewing. And then I press that seam open before I use a seam ripper to open up those stitches. And you might think, is it faster to do it this way? Probably not, but that's not the goal of taking some of those extra steps. Often those extra steps are there, at least for me, to make the process smoother. And I heard somebody say, slow is smooth and smooth is fast. Especially in sewing, where if you make a mistake and you have to unpick it, it's not only that it takes time, but it also costs energy because it's frustrating. So maybe you're not saving a lot of time, but you might be saving yourself some frustration from having to redo certain steps. After pressing the edges, we're going to fold it in half and press in a center crease. And later on, we're going to use that center crease to align the strap and the loop. We're going to sew the loop in 2 steps. First, attach it to the edge of the wrap and then fold it over and top stitch. I decided to add in another crease, but this time to the strap, just finger press that in and it helps you align it to the center crease of the wrap. Before you start sewing, make sure that the little loop strap is at a 90-degree angle to the edge of the wrap. Before you remove the pin, do a couple of stitches using the hand wheel under your sewing machine to make sure that the loop is already pretty secure. Then fold over the loop and pin it to the center crease of the wrap. And put the needle down before you remove the pin. To attach the strap to tie it closed, I'm also going to sew it in 2 steps. First attach it to the wrap and then fold it over to top stitch. I'll top stitch in 3 spots along the base and at 2 other spots, creating a little loop underneath the strap. I didn't measure any of it, but at the end you want to have about 4 inches or 10 centimeters of strap hanging free that you can use to tie it closed. Before I fold over the strap and do the top stitching, I'm going to take a moment to remove all the thread tails. That way they can't get tangled once I start sewing. Before I do the top stitching, I take a moment to align the strap and align it to the center crease. And then along the strap, you want to top stitch at about 1 inch intervals or 2.5 centimeters. And I'm not going to use a ruler, I'll use the width of 2 fingers to decide on the position of the top stitching. And since cutlery or silverware has different sizes, I'm going to use my spoon to decide on how far I'm going to fold in those points. When you think you have a good fit, add some pins and try it out with your cutlery. And then reposition if needed. I ended up with a gap of about 4 centimeters, which is about 1.5 inch. Now, if you were to use this wrap for something smaller, like a pencil, then you can always pull the points closer to the center and completely omit the loop. Press the sides before completely stitching around the edge and closing the gap, and attaching the strap to the top of the wrap. To top stitch all around the edge, I'm going to align the edge of the project to the gap in my presser foot and then slightly move the needle position over to the left. Whenever I get to one of the corners, I put the needle down and pivot the work. As I approach the top of the wrap and the strap, I go slowly and make sure everything's positioned correctly, and then wait to remove the needle until my needle is actually in the strap. And when I reach the gap in the project, I take a moment to make sure everything's aligned properly before I sew over it. When you reach the loop in the center, you might have to lift up the presser foot just before you sew over it, because otherwise you run a chance of the presser foot pushing it slightly and it being off.